Hello and welcome to another tier list video. Today we are taking a look at the Half-Life games. Now I am a huge fan of the Half-Life series. I've played all the games with the exception of Half-Life Alyx, which is why it's not on this list. I would absolutely love to play it, I've heard great things, but I just don't have a VR set at this point. I also excluded Half-Life 2 Lost Coast from this list because that one, it's more so just a separate chapter of Half-Life 2. It's not really its own full game. It's just so short, so I left that one off, but I'm a huge fan of the Half-Life series. I've played all these games several times through, so starting us off, we have Half-Life 1, the original, the game that started it all, really. It shot Valve, into the center stage of gaming at that time, and Half-Life 1 just feels great, considering it's a game that came out in the 90s. Many first-person shooters that came out of the 90s, I find really don't hold up with modern gameplay. They just usually feel clunky, or the shooting is bad, or the movement is bad. This is not the case with Half-Life 1. The movement feels great. It feels great to move around, to run, to jump, and then also the shooting gameplay is still really good. It feels good. There's no forced mouth smoothing or anything like there is in some games of that era. Overall, the gameplay is super good, and then that's not even mentioning the story, which I think is phenomenal. Coming into Half-Life 1, if you don't know the story, it's just so great. It starts a little bit slow at the beginning, and then it jumps you right into the Resonance Cascade, and it's just so much fun. Exploring Black Mesa is so cool, just, the environment, learning more about the story. Oftentimes in games, I feel like you know way more than the character does, and you feel like you're waiting for them to catch up with the knowledge that you have. But in Half-Life, you're really learning things as you go along in the game with Gordon Freeman, and it's just really cool. The gameplay is great, considering it came out in the 90s. It's phenomenal how well the gameplay holds up. Obviously, the graphics are not going to hold up, but you could go for a game like Black Mesa if you want the modern graphics. But overall, Half-Life's just a phenomenal game. Probably my favorite one on this list if I had to pick one. And for that reason, it's going to find itself in the S tier. Up next, we have Half-Life Blue Shift. Now, this is one of the side releases to Half-Life 1. In here, you play as Barney, the security guard. Half-Life Blue Shift and Opposing Force are both kind of, happening at the same time as Half-Life 1 when you're playing as Gordon Freeman. And honestly, Blue Shift, it definitely has some positive aspects about it. It's definitely cool to, learn a little bit more, to see a little bit more of Black Mesa. That being said, if I were to, exclude any game on this list as one that's not necessary to play, I would say it's probably Blue Shift. It's a very short game. You can pick it up for like $5 on Steam, but honestly, I'd wait for it to go on sale because you're really only going to get roughly 2 hours, give or take half an hour, 45 minutes on either end, depending on how quick you are of gameplay. And so it's marginally worth the money, but if you're a big Half-Life fan and you're looking for more and you've played all the other games, definitely pick it up. It's still worth a play, but as far as this list go, it's definitely the weakest one, and for that reason, going to find itself down in the D tier. Up next, we have Half-Life Opposing Force, where you play as Commander Shepard. And he is, a part of the unit that's coming to Black Mesa to basically clean it up, so to speak. And honestly, this is another phenomenal game. It's super fun. It's definitely shorter than Half-Life 1, which you would expect. But honestly, I think with the time that it does have, it does a really, really good job. And there definitely are some parts in Half-Life 1 that, maybe feel a little bit slow, or you kind of have to slog through. There's really none of that in Opposing Force for me. It's just a great game from start to finish. The story is great, the guns are cool, fighting alongside the military, fighting the aliens, the different weapons you could use. It's just such a great game, and if you liked Half-Life 1, I highly, highly recommend playing Opposing Force, because honestly, it's pretty much just a different take on the Half-Life 1 game, and it's really fresh. Playing it is a ton of fun. Between Blue Shift and Opposing Force, I think Opposing Force is by far the stronger one. Really, really solid game, and for that reason, going to find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have Half-Life 2. Honestly, Half-Life 2 with the jump to the Source engine, I thought it was great. Once again, this game came out in, I believe, the early 2000s, but it still feels really good to play. Similar to Half-Life 1, I think they put a lot of focus into the physics and the gameplay, the movement. It just feels really good moving around the map, running and shooting. And of course, the gravity gun. I mean, the physics in this game were unparalleled for, other games at the time. And it even still feels really good to pick up and play today. So Half-Life 2, definitely really solid. By far the longest game, I would say, in the series. When I first played this game, I mean, I was terrible at the puzzles, but it took me a long time. I put in a lot of hours, and honestly, it's just a super great game. The world is super, super cool, just exploring, you know, what happened to Earth, you know, post Resonance Cascade from Half-Life 1. And overall, it's just such a fresh experience, and if you've never played any of the Half-Life games and you're turned off by the Half-Life 1 graphics, just play Half-Life 2. It's a really solid game, and honestly, I don't have much negative to say about it, so it's also going to find itself in the S tier. Up next, we have Half-Life 2 Episode 1, the sequel to Half-Life 2. Definitely shorter than Half-Life 2, I think, which is why they didn't, you know, make it Half-Life 3. But it's still a really solid game. You know, you get a lot of the same aspects that were strong in Half-Life 2 are also strong in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. That being said, I would say there's not nearly as much storyline development in this game. There definitely is some really fun battles and engagements with the aliens. That being said, it's a bit shorter, and you know, some people have complained that this game, you're spending a lot of time just, you know, driving, which I definitely agree. I think there's a bit too much of that in this game, and well, it's still a strong game. It's not quite as strong as the other ones on this list, so it's going to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have Half-Life 2 Episode 2, the sequel to Episode 1, as you could guess. This one I found is a bit longer than Episode 1, but definitely not nearly as long as Half-Life 2 itself. But overall, it's still a really solid game. Of course, it leaves us on the cliffhanger. You know, all these years later, we still do not have Half-Life 3. Unless you're saying Half-Life Alyx is Half-Life 3. But we're still waiting for the continuation of, you know, this game, really. Which may never come, but, you know, that's okay. I've kind of accepted that at this point. That being said, I think Half-Life 2 Episode 2 is a really solid game. You know, it's not quite as grindy and drivey as Half-Life 2 Episode 1 is. And honestly, there's some really, really fun engagements with Half-Life 2 Episode 2, and some really interesting puzzles as well, which are usually my least favorite part of the game, but I think they do a great job in this game. You know, like I said, just waiting for the next one, but Half-Life 2 Episode 2 for me is going to be in the A tier. Well, that's my list. Let me know your guys' thoughts, and I hope you enjoy.